Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. I'm Alison Stewart and I'm your host for Cut the Crop. And today we have our resident far cereal expert who seems to be coming on a regular basis. But anyway, welcome, Jo. Nice to see you again.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about selecting cultivars for autumn sowing. So how should growers make a decision about what cereal cultivars they should be sowing this coming autumn?
Right. Well, when I talked about this last year, we talked about how cultivar selection is really important because it really sets the foundation for the type of management that you need to implement later in the season. And one of the things we've talked about subsequent to that is we've got all of these new cultivars that are coming through with really good resistance rating packages and making sure that we're protecting those cultivars as they're coming through, because the development phase of those cultivars is relatively long. And we know that over time, some of these cultivars break down. So by managing them appropriately, we're able to extend their useful life. And we're also able to make strategic decisions about what we put on that can have implications in terms of our gross margin, in terms of disease control, resistance management, and also on the profitability of our system.
So I see you sitting there with a green book in your hand.
I am, yes.
Yeah, so do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. So what I've got in front of me is our updated cereal disease management strategy, and that was published in September of last year. So for those of you who can see me, it looks like this. But for those of you who are online, that can be found on our FAR website, and you may have even had one through the post. And what that does is it pulls all of the research that we've been doing over a 2 or 3 year period, and it presents some results and gives some options and things that you can look at to implement on your farm. And chief among that is the cultivar selection work that we've been looking at, particularly with regard to fungicide management.
Yeah. So do you find now that when people are looking to select their cultivars, that they're using a number of different attributes now as part of the decision framework? And is disease resistance becoming an increasingly more important criteria that they're using?
Oh, absolutely. And I think I need to point out with disease ratings, there are a number of diseases out there. And while Septoria triticide blotch is the main one that we look at, we can't forget that there are things like leaf rust and powdery mildew out there. And when we produce the cultivar evaluation booklets, the ratings for all of those cultivars are published within that. So look at the risk factors that you've got in your system. So we talk about cultural control methods being the next piece up in our integrated sort of pest management pyramid that sits sort of above that cultivar selection. So some of those things involve things like your position and your rotation, because some rotation positions come with a higher risk than others. So you wouldn't want to be putting a cultivar into a position that was going to stress it a little bit. Places like second wheat positions, we know that cultivars that perform really well as first wheats don't always perform really well as second wheats. So you have to think about that. Think about your sowing date. When we're talking about disease ratings, we're really managing our exposure to pathogens. And by delaying your sowing date, you can actually sort of reduce the risk of disease coming into your crop. And there's a whole heap of other things as well that sort of need to just sort of, you need to just sort of factor in as you go. And all of those are detailed within our cereal disease management strategy, and also within that strategy, we've published a traffic light approach. So you can look at what your risk factors are and have a look at where you sit within that sort of range of inputs.
So just talk me through that. If I was a grower, what would that look like?
If I was a grower, I would think, well, I am in mid-Canterbury and I'm irrigated, so already there's a little bit of risk associated with that. I think about when I'm going to be planting, so I might be planting sort of towards the middle to the end of April, so that pushes that risk a little bit lower. Then if I select a cultivar that's got a really good disease tolerance and good package of disease management issues that you can work through, that might pull you back from being in a really high risk zone to something in a more moderate zone. And really it's about choosing a management package that's going to be appropriate to the system that you've got.
So I mean, that's one component, and you talked about that whole, sort of management pyramid of cultivars and fungicides and managing resistance. I suppose that leads on to the new program that we're part of, the A Lighter Touch program. So just talk us through why we joined up to A Lighter Touch and what we're trying to achieve for our growers by being part of that program.
So it's a really large program of work, and it's looking at agroecological systems for pest management. And really that's placing the crop at the centre of the decision making. Rather than looking at a specific pest in a specific season at a specific time, it's looking at it across the board. And what it's looking at doing is it's having long-term reductions in the amount of inputs that we apply. And there's a number of reasons why we want to do that. And one of them, and that's really important for our growers, is going to be resistance management. Another thing is going to be reduced environmental footprint, and also thinking about sort of consumers and consumer demand. We're wanting to have lighter touch programs that don't compromise on our profitability. And one of the other things that we're looking at implementing is introducing things lighter touch chemistries and the likes of biopesticides, identifying products that are going to be relevant to our arable sector. And if we find products that are relevant to our arable sector, making sure that those products then have a good pathway going through our registration system so we can integrate them into our programs.
And I guess, I did send you a research paper the other week where there had been a big program of work done overseas in the Netherlands, where they were looking at what were the drivers that either convince or prevent a grower from reducing their pesticide use. And it was quite interesting that it was very much other growers showing that it could be done that seemed to be the most positive driver. And the negative driver was a perception that this substantially increased the risk of lower yield and reduced profitability. So, that was obviously done in Europe with thousands of growers over there. Do you think, though, that a lot of the outcomes from that work are relevant to the arable situation in New Zealand?
Absolutely, I do. And one of the things that we're looking at in our cultivar by fungicide program is trying to quantify that risk, because when you're thinking about your decision making, risk is a really key one and it shouldn't ever be discounted. When we ran through the data from our last season, we actually found that the gross margin of our reduced input fungicide program was no different to a full Rolls-Royce approach. So that shows us this flexibility within those cultivars, especially if you're selecting one with a strong resistance management package. So by taking that lighter touch approach, you're actually going to be saving yourself a bit of money and you're not going to compromise on your yield. But you have to bear in mind that each season is going to be different, and how you manage your crop in each season is going to be different. And that's why it's really important when you've got all your ducks in a row in terms of your time of sowing and your cultivar, that you really get out there and really monitor your crop, or have an advisor or an agronomist who's going to really help you through that process, because one of the biggest barriers is having faith in your own decision making. And as growers, I know that growers are really onto it and they're really keen to look in their crops and understand how to manage their system better. And when they look at the profitability of their system, if there is a way for you to reduce your expenditure on your inputs and still guarantee that you're going to get the same gross margin, well, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. And fungicides are, a particularly expensive component of the input. So, one fungicide spray does make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly in this season, where in parts of the country we were particularly dry, the data that we've got coming out of those types of trials where we didn't put on our last application because things were so dry and we knew we were already going to be yield limited, that actually made a really big difference to our margin. And it also made a difference in terms of driving resistance, and it also made a difference to our pocket.
So, coming back to autumn sowing, are there any new cultivars that are sort of making their way through out into the field this year, or is it pretty much the sort of same cohort that we're delivering last year?
It's similar to the same cohort that we're delivering last year. There are the generalist cultivars out there, and last year I spoke a bit about the likes of Graham, and there's a whole range of cultivars coming through the system, things like Kieran, which is the world beater, Firelight, the likes of Gleam, a lot of general purpose cultivars that have a really sort of wide spectrum of sowing windows and reasonable disease management packages. So there's also a few coated cultivars coming through our cultivar evaluation trials that look really promising. So there's plenty out there for growers to choose.
And where are most of these cultivars coming from? Are they coming from European breeding programs?
Most of the cultivars that we have through New Zealand have European or UK sort of ancestry to them. And some of them are actually cultivars that growers who've been in the UK or UK growers who've moved here will be quite familiar with.
Yeah. So what about the whole, climate change scenario? Are we trying to access germplasm from sort of like warmer temperate climates in order to simulate what cultivars may actually be relevant in a climate change scenario?
Well, I'm not a breeder, but I'm pretty sure there's work going on breeding programs looking around things like drought tolerance, because as we know, as things get a little bit warmer, that actually does increase our disease pressure because it reduces that latent period of those cycles. So I know there'll be things in the pipeline that people will be looking at, and if they're not, they need to.
Yeah. What about, growers, say, up in the North Island or the south of the South Island? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're obviously going to be choosing slightly different cultivars than to Mid-Canterbury.
They may or they may not. Some of the cultivars that perform really well in Mid-Canterbury don't necessarily perform well in places like Southland or, say, up in the Manawatu, but some of them do. And a lot of those generalist cultivars are pretty good across the board.
Yeah. So, top 5 picks.
Oh, I don't know if I could. I don't really know if I could name names. That might be a bit rude, but I think really the key is to have a look at the cultivar evaluation booklets when they come out. Have a look at your farm. Have a look at your risk factors, and then make the decision based on those.
Yeah. But all of these, for example, are we talking specifically milling wheat, or are we talking
We're talking specifically feed wheat. Milling wheats, they have a later sowing window, so there's already a reduction in the amount of potential inoculum that you've got flying around, because those aren't sort of sown until a bit later. However, they still have cultivar ratings, and it's really important to take those into consideration as well. Remember that with a shorter season, you've got a few more options in terms of tweaking your program as necessary.
So we were on a Zoom call last week with a researcher from the UK who was talking about, all the work that is done in the UK and other countries around fungicide resistance, sort of coding systems.
Yes.
Where does New Zealand sit with understanding how to manage fungicide resistance and fitting into the international sort of fungicide resistance?
I think it's really important that we start having those conversations. It's definitely something that needs to happen. We are all aware that the fungicide groups all have a coding system. So the likes of an SDHI would be a group 7 and a DMI would be a group 3. A multi-site might be group 21A or whatever it is. Strobilurine's a group 11. So we need to sort of normalise that language, not just across fungicides, but also across our insecticides and our herbicides. That's really, really important, because we know that with resistance, it's exposure
to the grouping and not necessarily to an individual product.
Absolutely, that are going to be really important. And FRAC, so that stands for the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, have some really strong guidelines around how products are used. But we've really got to make sure that when we join up, that we're giving the best outcomes for our growers.
Yeah. So final piece of advice to growers around planting this autumn?
Have a good look, consider your system, look at the cultivar evaluation booklets, think about the type of management system you think you want to do. If you want to take a punt and start thinking about reducing the inputs in your system, really consider what you've got in terms of your cultivar resistance. And remember that if you've got any questions on any of these things, documents like the cropping strategy, the cultivar evaluation booklets are there to help you. And also, please get in touch with us, because we're really keen to support growers as we transition to lighter touch programs.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jo.
Thanks, Alison.
Okay. And thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.